Hey everybody, and welcome to another edition of Board Games I Got Rid Of and Why. So in this series I take a look at games that have previously been in my collection but for one reason or another no longer are. But before I get started on these 10 games, I want to give a shout out to the show sponsor KIENDA.co.uk, who are my go-to online retailer when it comes to purchasing board games here in the UK. And if you use my link in the show notes or the QR code, then you can get 5% off your first order. The first game I'm talking about today is The Gardens, which is essentially a tile placement style game. However, it did use cards instead. And what you're doing is you're laying these cards out in these 3 different rows, which will create these kind of pathways and fountains and benches and things, which will all score in different ways. But the twist on this game was that on each of these rows, there was a meeple, and whenever you placed a new card down, the meeple will travel from its last location to the card that you've just placed, and that will trigger certain scoring as you go. Like, for example, it might say for every type of these trees that it passes through, you'll get a point, and different things like that. So I actually did quite like that idea in theory, and I do still think that that mechanism has a lot of unexplored potential, but I don't think this was the game to really showcase that mechanism because it was quite limited and it was tailored towards a kind of more gateway entry-level audience. It worked fine for what it was. I did think that the game had a bit of a glass ceiling on how many times you could play it, and I think people always kind of lean towards more widely known, more widely available games such as Carcassonne if you want this style of game. So I think this one was kind of struggling to find its place in the market, despite looking wonderful. You know, I really did like the visual appeal of this one, as you had this kind of like classical poster look to it with these thick black lines. You know, it looked really lovely on the table, but the gameplay was a little bit lacking for me. Next up, I have Switch and Signal, which just so happened to be my favourite co-op game that I played in 2022. So in this game, you are, of course, working together to try and manage the logistics of these different trains that are automatically moving on the board. And you're going to do that by playing these cards, which will change the switches and signals on the board. So, for example, there'll be these 3-way or 4-way junctions, and you'd have to kind of move these little tokens to show which route is active. You'd have to divert trains to try and manage them as efficiently as possible. And for every kind of piece of movement that you'd waste by having trains kind of stalled at junctions, you would suffer penalty points. It actually works extremely well. I tend to like pick up and deliver games, but I do tend to steer away from co-op games in general. I don't know what it is, but I do not really have that itch to explore co-op games. And when I do get them to the table, even though if I might appreciate them mechanically, I just don't get too much satisfaction out of working with others. I don't know why. So if I was to own a co-op game, I would probably choose Switch and Signal because it does what it does extremely well and it is very underrated. But because I'm not a fan of co-op games in general, I didn't really see the need for me to own this one, which is a bit of a shame because, again, it is so good. And in fact, for a solo game, it works really well too. So yeah, it's a kind of a near miss for me. It's just that I never have that itch to play co-op games. So therefore, I had to make the decision to cull Switch and Signal from the collection. Next up, I have Tawantinsuyu. Now, this was a kind of a sister game to the T series of games by Board and Dice. You know, thinking of games like Teletum or Tawantinsuyu, Zolkin. However, this one was not designed by Daniel Ishini. This was designed by David Turtzi. And it's a worker placement game that is physically daunting. I know this has a lot of worker placement spots here. And the idea of this one was that when you went to these different spots by playing these cards, the more you kind of pack your workers together, the stronger bonuses you'll get. And also these meeples would be color-coded, which will give you independent or kind of unique abilities depending on the meeples that you played. Mechanically, it was actually quite interesting. However, it was a bit convoluted. It was certainly not it wasn't a smooth game. There were certainly rules upon rules and some things you'd forget, some fiddliness there, which, to be honest, I did forgive because I thought every game I played of this was actually really enjoyable and it was rich in terms of the decision making. But I think this might be a case of wrong place, wrong time, that kind of thing. Because generally speaking nowadays, I want games that are a bit easier to pull off the shelf and get played straight away. This one's a little bit longer than I would like it to be. The teach is, again, a little bit of work. And again, it does have that real daunting table presence where there is so much symbology that it is a bit of an obstacle to overcome when you're teaching it to new people. And if I was to keep this in the collection, I'd probably always play it with 2 players, because I know that the 2 of us would know the rules, and I think the game is slightly better when it comes to that 3 or 4 player count. So I thought all those little things just made it a little bit problematic and a bit difficult to get it to the table, which was ultimately why I decided to cull it from the collection, despite me not really having a bad experience with it. But yeah, I just kind of want games that are a bit smoother now, that again I can put off the shelf without having to relearn all the rules. So that's why I got rid of Tawantinsuyu. Next up, I have Renature, which is a game that I've spoken very highly of in the past, and I still do like this game a lot. So it's an area control game, as you're trying to control these different regions by placing these bushes and trees. And of course, whoever has the most influence in those regions will score the more points. But I like the key mechanism here where you would use dominoes in order to spread your influence. So basically, you'd have these very nice wooden chunky dominoes, which would have these screen printed animals on them. And you couldn't kind of spread out unless you matched these animals up. And that's basically what you're doing. You were just kind of adding these dominoes onto the board. You're putting bushes down in the adjacent regions and trying to score the majorities there. And it works really well for what it does. But I think this was a matter of it being directly replaced by another game in my collection. So I had this before I picked up a game called Rumble Nation, which you might know that I speak about a lot. And for me, Rumble Nation fits this niche a bit better for me, where if you want that kind of gateway level or introductory level area control game with still some meaningful decisions but very little rules, I think Rumble Nation does a better job of it than Renature does. Not much of a better, because I do like Renature a lot, but I think I have Rumble Nation to fill that niche, and if I want something a little bit above that, I'd probably play something like Mexica by the same designer. So it kind of bordered that line in between those 2 games, and I own these other 2, so I didn't really see the need to own this one as well. So that's why I decided to part with Renature. Next up, I have The Mind. So The Mind was a game that really did blow up in popularity quite a few years back now. So this is another co-op game where you are playing these cards down in your hand, and you're trying to do them in numerical order without breaking that pattern. And the twist of this game is that you cannot actually communicate what each player has in their hand. Of course, that would be very easy. So you have to kind of do this feeling out process of playing these cards down, noticing who's stalling, and try not to break that pattern to go from low to high. You go through all these different levels, getting more and more cards into your hand. And you know what, this game works way better than it should do. I've had tons of great games of this. And the reason I don't have this in my collection anymore is because I really did play this game to death with the same group. You know, I think we went on a holiday together and we played this again and again and again and again until we got extremely good at it, and we actually managed to complete the game and even go above that completion level and without making any mistakes. And that was completely without cheating as well. So normally when I play co-op games and we end up defeating the game, I have very little desire to go back and explore it anymore. You know, I felt the same way about many other co-op games in the past, where again, it's very difficult. Then you win the game, and then all of a sudden it's like, well, now I don't have that urge or that itch to defeat it. So that's kind of where I sit with The Mind. I have good memories of it. I think sometimes it gets a little bit of unfair treatment, saying it's not a game, but you know what, my enjoyment of that would contradict that statement, because this game is actually a hell of a lot of fun, and I would recommend it if you are interested in a really social and funny game. So that is The Mind, a good one, but one that I've completed. Next up, I have Bear Raid, which was a game I was really excited to play at the time, because I remember at the time I was really into my economic games, and this one was being advertised as something straightforward, very easy in terms of the rules overhead, and that was the case, because the rules was only like a single page, piece of paper, so you could learn the game ultra quickly. But when it came to playing the game, it was actually extremely confusing, and I could not wrap my head around the way everything fit together. And I remember playing this one with people I normally play these kind of games with, and it just was not sinking in, it was not clicking with them, and we were really struggling to find where the fun was here. And maybe I didn't give this one a fair shot, because we did play it once or twice, had a really bad experience both times, and were kind of moved swiftly on because of that. Where I think somewhere in there was a good game, but I was just really struggling to kind of extract it from it. So with so much stuff out there now, I'm not really willing to do deep dives into games that I'm not enjoying straight from the get-go, and I think Bear Raid was a victim of that. So therefore it had to go, because it just did not kind of strike a chord with us from the offset. So that is Bear Raid. Next up, I have Spike, which is almost a pick up and deliver train game as you're building this track on this map, trying to deliver goods to different places based on this dynamic market and trying to connect certain regions to certain regions. I did have a few issues with the balancing of this game because it seems like the market could have purely by chance benefited you because you're next to all the locations that have the highest worth or the highest value. But my biggest issue with this game was the pure lack of excitement and the plodding pace of it, because there was so much forward planning here. You could literally look at the map, you could see exactly what you needed to do based on the cards that you had, and then you'd spend the whole game just kind of going through the motions, playing out what you'd thought of 20 minutes ago or 50 minutes ago. So it almost had that feeling of frustration where you just wanted it to move faster, and yeah, it moved at a very slow pace, considering you already knew what you were going to do several turns in advance. The game also had some pretty shocking production. These little train pieces or the little track pieces you'd put on the board were very cheap and light and just did not work and just did not fit together well. And it's just a horrible kind of physical production. And the game itself was just boring. It's just a matter of that, really. Too slow and too boring. And obviously for that reason, Spike had to go. Next up, I have Aladdin's Dragons, the card game, which I believe is almost identical to the board game version of the same name. Now this one, you are kind of placing these workers down with these cards. They come in different levels, and you can even put them together to have stronger workers. You're collecting these gems from these different piles and scoring points, essentially. I didn't dislike the game, but I did find it completely forgettable. You know, I'm even struggling to kind of hark back and think how I felt about this game, and I've even forgotten a lot of the mechanisms in it because it was so generic in the way it felt. And I think there's been so many worker placement games out there since this one, it really has been lost in the shuffle, and I think it's even a bit dated. So I don't really see the need, or I wouldn't recommend this to anybody really, because I even think if you're into lighter, more simple worker placement games, there's loads better than this one. So yeah, I can't recommend it because it is so generic and so forgettable, and that's ultimately why it went. But I suppose the only redeeming feature about this one was that it was like a full worker placement game, but in a tiny box of cards. So if storage space is at a premium to you, then maybe look at this one if that outweighs the benefits of being a pretty generic game. So there we go, that's my thoughts on Aladdin's Dragons and why it left the collection. Next up is definitely the heavy hitter on this list. This is Orléans. So Orléans, another game that I've spoken highly of throughout the years, a fantastic kind of bag building game. You're putting these chips into the bag, drawing them out to activate different spots on your player boards, to climb tracks, make you better at different things. Works extremely well, a lot of fun, and actually a really smooth game. Now, it's also one of those games that is ranked highly on my top 100 for many, many years now. So you might ask, why did I get rid of it? Number one, I played it so much, and each time I play it, I kind of go for the same thing because that strategy has generally served me quite well. But I suppose the main reason is because one of my friends in my immediate gaming group has a copy. So I do have immediate access to this game should I want to play it, and I don't need to fill up my own shelf with something I've played so many times. So I do highly advocate this game still, especially with the trade and intrigue expansion. But do I need to own it anymore when I can play it anytime? Probably not, considering I have played it so much. So that is why Orléans left the collection. Nothing bad, it's just a matter of me trying to free up some space. And the final game I'm talking about today is Bristol 1350, which on paper had me highly interested because I love the idea of this one, as you are trying to flee the city of Bristol without being infected by the Black Plague. And the Black Plague would be kind of represented by these cards in your hand. They'd all be numbered, and if you ever went above a certain number of these cards, then you'd be infected for the rest of the game, and you'd be essentially out of winning. And the idea was you were trying to be the first out of the city without being infected, and then you'd be the victor. However, this game was very unfriendly if you had dishonest people in your group, because if you ever went above that plague limit, you should be infected for the rest of the game. However, there were ways to kind of manipulate your hand to get rid of high cards, get low cards back in, meaning that you'd be under that threshold, and nobody could ever really enforce or kind of verify that you were not ever infected. So you could actually lie and say, I was never infected, and I've now won the game because I'm below the limit. So that was one reason, which it's forgivable because, you know, if you want to break the game, that would at least be done through, you know, cheating, I suppose. But the thing I really didn't like about this game was that once you were infected, there was really no incentive to continue and no goal to aim towards. Yes, you could try be a bit of a nightmare and try and infect everybody else and stop anybody else from winning. But from a thematic standpoint, why would you do that? What's the point? You may as well try and at least let somebody else live on and continue. So it did feel like once you were over that limit, and that could happen really early in the game, it just felt like you were completely disengaged and you had no reason to continue. But I do feel like with some house rules and some reworking of it, this could be a good game here, but I think they did miss the mark in terms of the design element of the game. And, you know, from a production standpoint, it looked wonderful. So yeah, lots of potential here, but I just think the designers needed to go back to the drawing board and just tweak a few things to make it a solid game that was mechanically sound as well as a cool idea. So that's why Bristol had to go, because it just did not work. So that concludes the video. Hopefully you have enjoyed it. If you have, please be sure to hit like and subscribe to my channel and check out my other content too. But for everybody else, I'll see you next time on Chairman of the Board. Bye bye.